We'd like to begin our talk with a sonic land acknowledgement. And settlers of many origins are encouraged now in Canada to understand the treaty histories of the lands where they live. And it's expected that community events will begin with a land acknowledgement, which is an acknowledgement of the visitor status of the speaker, the guest status of the speaker, in relation to the local Indigenous holders of the land. So during the minute which follows now, we invite you to also consider the holders of the land wherever you may be joining us from.
We would like to acknowledge that in Kingston, Ontario, also known as Cataraqui, we are guests on the territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee. To begin our talk, which will embrace sound and listening in relation to life geography, we would like to thank you for sharing in that listening that we just had. So what you will hear are some of William W.H. Gunn's birdsong recordings from across Ontario. That's what you heard.
Yes.
Played at a much slower speed. And the sounds were transduced through two large shards of a lightning blasted white pine tree, the remains of which stand just meters from Gunn's former cabin in the center of the park. The pine shards are in effect the cones of our loudspeakers. Sounds are literally resonating through them. We would also like to acknowledge and thank our hosts in this gathering, which I understand I just heard before we began from Innes that it's been running since 1981, for the great privilege of being able to share some thoughts with you today.
So entitled Listener, when our project began, it was about the life and work of Bill Gunn. We came to him as a sound artist and an academic and a historical geographer with a long focus on the oral. We centered Gunn as one of Canada's first and foremost important wildlife recordists, one of the first people to compile a library of environmental sounds for licensed commercial and research uses, a library which the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation once described as, quote, one of the largest collections of bird, insects, and mammal sounds in the world, unquote. Gunn's work was significant throughout the second half of the 20th century in shaping the ways settler Canadians understood and sensorially experienced nature. The more we've listened to Gunn, and some of his many albums are shown here, and the more we've delved more deeply into our own listening practices, the more this has become a project of decentering or reframing, repositioning Gunn in relation to his context. This life geography has become increasingly interesting to us because it is about relations between Gunn and lives in the plural, including the millions of voices which he spent his life collecting, editing, and placing in the public's ear.
Our joint project has certainly been a slow one.
This is a text box. Sorry, Kirsten.
Our project's been slow. Every once in a while, speeded up by assistants and collaborators. Our first interest in Gunn dates back to around 2005, and a team project involving transnational ecologies and Kirsten Greer who today, just before this meeting, had an author meets critics session in London for her wonderful book, Red Coats and Wild Birds. Our slowness has been due not only to the slow process of locating, listening, and negotiating the deposit of Gunn's papers and remaining tape library with Queen's archives and interruptions such as COVID, but because our process has coincided and been entwined with major shifts and new compelling work in sound studies and geography, which pulled us up short, not least in terms of Indigenous resurgence and decolonial practices.
Our colleague, Dr. Dylan Robinson, offered us early readings of what became his book, Hungry Listening, which invites deep rethinking of our individual critical listening positionality. Hungry listening is, in a reductive nutshell, Robinson's term for an extractive and teleological way of sonically apprising the world, which he associates with a settler modality that is also expressed in other forms of extractive living, and a normativity which, for instance, ignores the subtlety of Indigenous song as history and law. Robinson writes, decolonizing musical practice involves becoming no longer sure what listening is. In working with Gunn, our practice has shifted to exploring, critiquing, and reworking Gunn's field practices of listening, recording, and editing, many of which exhibit the fixed attention, competitiveness, and extractive hunger characteristic of settler colonial listening.
Through academic publication and presentation, but also with artistic research creation, we have in our labs and in the field been exploring Gunn's various methodologies and practices and their potential for transformation. In the Canadian academic context, research creation is a mode of knowledge generation through artistic production, which can take many forms. Our solar-powered installation Into the Middle of Things invited listeners in Algonquin territory at the Outdoor Gallery fieldwork to consider the voices of white-throated sparrows from Gunn's library, inviting questions of what do I hear, but also what happened here and what is absent, what don't I hear?
A key technique in Gunn's practice and teaching was to slow down the playback of his birdsong recordings to reveal temporal details unable to be perceived at full speed. The celebrated Canadian wildlife artist Robert Bateman, who learned fieldwork techniques from Gunn at Algonquin Park Research Station as a teenager in the late 1940s, told us of the profound effect this had on him, recalling, quote, "He had the ability to slow down songs, and just how incredible it was to hear a wood thrush or a winter wren, and the complexity you'd hear when it was slowed down was just mind-boggling, and it began, in a sense, my philosophy that nature is not just more complicated than we know, it's more complicated than we can know."
Before people like Bateman alerted us to the impacts of Gunn's slowing, we had already been exploring sound transformations through speed changes in various ways. For instance, in our 2007 performance, Transnational Ecologies, we learned Keegan was there, which is very cool. We realized a composition by Alvin Lucier for which we used birdsong with speed changes. So it took on the lower frequency swooping qualities of humpback whale song. As the sound moved, like the sound was shaped by the space it was in, and then it traveled on to other sites. You can see you just saw younger versions of ourselves, and there's Hayden Lorimer and Chris Philo, as the sound traveled from Edinburgh to Glasgow, and then from there, I think it went on to Australia, and then to many other sites before returning back to Edinburgh, profoundly changed.
Yeah, so the idea is that the sound is transformed by passing through many different acoustic spaces, and then you hear it at the end as it's been transformed just by the acoustics of passing through these different rooms. I had in 2001 also used the slowed down voice of Queen Victoria in the only known recording of hers, which I was able to obtain from the British Library. It's not 100% sure that it's her, but in any case, I used the slowed down voice of Queen Victoria to activate the acoustics of the empty Elvedon Hall in Suffolk, once owned by her friend Duleep Singh, the last child Maharaja of the Punjab. These are two of many examples of our uses of slowing of sound. We'll come back to discussing how prevalent the technique of slowing has been in 20th century and contemporary music. Now, some of our other works relating to Gunn. This installation, Octet, employed stage microphones suspended in a tree, but used in reverse as tiny loudspeakers, playing slowed birdsong recordings from Gunn's archive, and occasionally his voice, not slowed, announcing the next bird. So this piece is intended to reposition Gunn in his field, not as objective listener, but as subject, and also to evoke the sort of the nature of birds as performers, as star individual performers, which we'll talk more about. Of course, humans' experience of slowness is entirely relational. The detail revealed in slowed down birdsong is presumably easily perceived by the birds themselves without the need for multi-speed tape decks or digital workstations.
Slowing and slow have many other associations, and one is as resistance to a world driven by commerce, which assumes faster is better. Ines Keegren, one of our hosts, wrote in 2016 that slow scholarship, which can be an act of political resistance, also was a basic requirement for rich and nuanced research. With time, quote, we gain humility and perspective. Slowing has become an important scholarly and artistic technique beyond historical geography. Joshua Whitehead and Dylan Robinson have both used techniques of slowness in their writing, creating impasses which force the reader to stop, unlearn, and take stock.
This slide came up a little early, but this relates to Laura's sister, textile artist Heather Cameron, who I believe is on the call, who shares affinities with this approach in a new series of pieces. This one featuring a line from Bruno Latour in a Guardian piece he wrote before his death last month. It required concentrated time not only to make, but requires time to read in the somewhat difficult font she deliberately chose. In such work, slowness can be anti-oppressive, decolonial, meditative, earth-honoring. Importantly, it can be about ethical encounter.
Slowness, for instance, emerged as a major theme of the 2022 Digital Ecologies and Practices Conference in Bonn this past summer, with artists creating novel listening situations, stretching out time to give the sense of listening differently in more than human worlds, working to, quote, slow down, speculate, and invent new modes of ethically living together. Yet, as Mark Peter Wright says in his new book, Hearing After Nature, quote, technology was never an objective witness, and the field was never a site of impartial encounter, unquote. As many listeners in the Zoom today have taught us with their research and writing over the last many years, the capacity of technology in the field to allow for ethical encounter is all about context. And so in thinking about Bill Gunn's context, we must consider not only the wonder elicited from Gunn's human audience when he began slowing things down, but also some attendant processes of normalization, extraction, and exclusion.
So when Gunn obtained his first tape recorder in 1950, at the age of 37, it was at the insistence of his father, nicknamed Gunny, who had not purchased it with his son to record birdsong, but rather to improve Bill's diction. He had long been concerned with his son's seeming inability to speak clearly, with lack of projection and too rapid speech. Gunny had it that, quote, the Gunns mumbled because they had Indian teeth and an Anglo-Saxon mouth, a condition of mixed ancestry, requiring diagnosis, treatment, and improvement. Notably, the treatment chosen here was not a traditional speech therapy based on exploring mental conflicts rooted in family and social dynamics. The new technology could allow him to hear himself so he could self-correct, allowing others to clearly hear the detail in his speech. And we'll play an excerpt now from an interview. I'm trying to get to my button for playing the sound. We'll play an excerpt now from an interview in which he talks about this moment, which coincided with tape recorders entering the public market. This is not a terrific recording, but it's been cleaned up somewhat to hopefully make it intelligible to you. Have a close listen.
And at that time, my father, who has always been worried about not projecting my voice and nothing under my breath, thought it would be a great thing if I could hear myself on tape. And that would bring great improvements in my diction. So tape recorders were just coming out at that time in Canada. And we bought one called an Arrow, which had to be plugged into the mains. And of course I could see the possibilities of recording birds. This technique, if only you could move around differently.
Just to repeat something of what he said there, he said, we bought one called an Arrow, which had to be plugged into the mains, and of course I could see the possibilities of recording birds as a technique, if only you could move around a bit.
And as soon as he could, he got a good portable recorder and designed a parabola for his microphone to better isolate individual sounds in the field. Gunn's next machine, also purchased with his father, was a Magnacord PT6. The Magnacord was an amazing thing. It promised to treat speech problems and much else as well.
We'll just leave that here for a second, but we don't have the time to delve into this, but the many uses of the Magnacord. So Peter Paul Kellogg, director of the Cornell Library of Natural Sounds, who had been in correspondence with Gunn since 1950, received this letter from him in 1952, enthusing about hearing Jim Facet's experiments in composing with slowed down birdsong. This was offered as novel intermission entertainment in the weekly New York Philharmonic broadcast from New York City on November 30th, 1952, of which Facet was a host. Gunn was surprisingly struck by his listening experience. Quote, "Those low-speed renditions of the song sparrow and hermit thrush are really out of this world." By 1952, however, a body of theoretical work and practical experiments in sound editing and playback speed changes had already been achieved by the originators of musique concrète in France, Pierre Schaeffer and Pierre Henry, as well as experimenters such as John Cage in North America. Indeed, there were earlier experiments in slowing down sound. We could go back to Stefan Volpe in a Dada event in 1920 using 8 gramophones with free speed control, not just the set speeds of 45 and 78 and so on, but free speed control. Emil Berliner had made experiments in 1889. He was, of course, one of the originators of the phonograph. Darius Milhaud, much more associated with acoustic composition, is said to have made experiments with changes in vocal speeds in France between 1922 and 27. Paul Hindemith, around 1930, created several pieces that he called Trickaufnahmen, which explored recording different instruments at different speeds. So all of these are topics for further research, but we're not going to delve further into those earlier ones here. However, to just say a little bit more about Schaeffer and Henry in the musique concrète world, initially working with disc cutters to make their own records for playback and further mixing, musique concrète theorists Schaeffer and Henry worked with magnetic tape from 1950. Musique concrète was founded on the concept of the objet sonore, which has resonance with the practice of isolated species recording begun by Ludwig Koch and continued by Gunn. As theorized by Schaeffer and Henry, the sound object is a recording of a sound event which has been brought into the laboratory, disconnected from its origins, and is to be considered for its intrinsic qualities only, absolutes which can be measured, such as amplitude envelope and spectrum. The origin of the sound and its effective nature, a part of which is dependent on extra musical associations at least, is not considered to be of interest. In the collecting practice of Koch and Gunn, and Peter Paul Kellogg and other professional bird recordists of the era, the capture of a perfect specimen, as isolated from its soundscape context as possible, was also all important.
Gunn was also connected in terms of practice to the world of musique concrète through his work as a de facto composer, using the same studio tools of careful editing, equalization, and mixing as were explored by Schaffer, Henry, and others working with tape editing, including John Cage. Gunn's score, shown here, for his best-known album, A Day in Algonquin Park, is rendered as a proportional timeline, visually similar to graphical musical scores of the day being invented by Cage and others. Gunn does not treat tape speed with the same compositional freedom as Jim Fassett in his Symphony of the Birds, but otherwise his score is a system, which, according to much contemporaneous work by composers on the fringes of contemporary practices, circa 1950, describes the arrangement of sound materials in time. 2 layers of edited recordings with crossfades and EQ notes, carefully composed to create an illusion of continuity. No speed changes, I'd note, were employed here.
And Gunn was really trying to create a naturalistic presentation of these sounds. So that was his goal in combining these 2 layers. These are just some other, where Gunn did explore speed changes was in his public talks. He could, but I wanted to talk through sorry. I'm just going to pause here to mention these. What I'm showing here are some examples of other scores from the era, which are, this one is from John Cage, showing tape editing moves with a razor blade to be made upon 8 different reels of tape. So this is also, a proportional timeline way of presenting the score. Same with this John Cage score, which is a score for assembling excerpts of many, many popular music recordings. And this is a 1950 score from Morton Feldman for acoustic performance, but nevertheless, it shows the same kind of general attention to, different frequency ranges, and without being specific in this case. Anyway, it's another timeline graphic score. So where Gunn did explore speed changes was in his public talks. He could bring to his audiences the same ear-opening responses that he had experienced in coming to know a hidden world of sound revealed by slowing his birdsong recordings. And one of his earliest talks was given at the National Museum in Ottawa in 1953. The article by reporter John Dalrymple bears out Rachel Mundy's thesis in Animal Musicalities that, quote, music's ordering has become entwined with attempts to categorize and classify songs in relation to animals, unquote. Dalrymple hears Gunn's animal sounds in terms of his understandings of human music. From the tin can syncopations of tree frogs, which cause Gunn's eyes to glaze over like a jazz fiend, to the, quote, far less unpleasant strains of a slowed down wren, which caused him to imagine refined classical training with its complicated trills from bass to coloratura soprano.
In slowing the tape, too soon for CBC, then slowing the tape, suddenly Gunn's wren is a cultured, serious musician to the writer's ears. So clearly, we're also dealing here with cultural and racial stereotypes in these comparisons and longstanding white assumptions of the elevated status of classical music. We would point to current work by Philip Ewell on the, quote, white racial frame of musicology, which has elevated certain 18th and 19th century musical practices into a normative standard by which other musics are judged. Gunn also slowed birdsong for a radio broadcast. For instance, he hosted a series for CBC Radio called Soundings, Natural Curiosity in 1963, in which he slowed a recording by Mrs. Howard Bell of a skylark singing uninterrupted for 2 minutes outside of the city of Victoria, British Columbia. We would play it for you now, but CBC is being very slow about giving us access.
Gunn also reached out internationally to musicologists, collaborating with the zoomusicologist Petr Joke and technician M. Philip to report findings of extraordinary significance within Gunn's recordings through what they termed sound microscopy. The co-authors analyzed the slowed songs of 5 individual hermit thrushes with Philip's new device, the fundamental frequency recorder. Underscoring scientifically the awe to be found in listening into the musical microcosm, they argued that their discovery via slowing of highly structured human-like avian music challenged the divide between animals and humans, between zoology and human musicology, as this hermit thrush music existed as a, quote, world phenomenon outside art and aesthetics.
Their claim, however exciting and challenging to human exceptionalism, has troubling assumptions to be noted. First of all, any definition of music is relational and cannot stand outside human structuring categories of aesthetics or science. The fundamental frequency recorder's finding of musical structure was based on a Western art conception of music. And again, we find here aesthetics of classical music standing at the apex of evolution. And the melodies that they found were ones extracted from the range of pitches and so-called background sound captured on tape. As Latour argued in his paper Anti-Zoom, and a shout out here to Hannah Hunter, who brought this paper to our attention, Anti-Zoom, in it, he addressed the world of images, but in an analogous situation with sound, there is no smooth zoom at all when one zooms into sound. If Philippe's device finds the fundamental only, ignoring all the other components of the sound's harmonics and partials, this is fundamentally different from the original recording, and a universe of difference away from the hermit thrush in real time, place, and relation.
So besides isolating the 5 hermit thrushes, should we just say about the, I just want to say about the fundamental frequency recorder, what's shown here is in the spectral display there is just the fundamental frequency, which typically is the strongest and lowest frequency in a complex sound. And so what the fundamental frequency recorder ignores is all the harmonics and partials and so on. So besides isolating the 5 hermit thrushes from their acoustic surroundings with the parabola and reducing their song to what was recognizable as music to their own ears, human relations to the hermit thrushes were fraught with assumptions about what is human as well as what is music. Bruno Latour has been gently haunting this paper, so we'll invoke him in conclusion by returning to our sonic land acknowledgement and reflecting a bit on what we were doing in our attempts to situate Gunn's recordings differently from the listening positionality depicted here. Here meaning with the parabola. Our main idea with the installation was pretty simple. The pine pieces. We wanted to create a reflexive listening situation with and for the expression of gratitude, but we were working with some other ideas too. Latour makes a useful distinction. Oh, sorry, that's a part that Laura was going to read.
I'm the big Latour fan. Latour makes a useful distinction between objects described as intermediaries and those that are mediators. Unlike intermediaries, which function as black boxes, mediators transform, translate, distort, and modify the meaning or the elements they are supposed to carry. So mediators transform meaning, whereas intermediaries do not. In our sounding sculpture, which frames the listener as active, we emphasize the materiality and transformational power of the mediator. The lightning blasted pine shards, which you are literally listening with and through, as you did at the beginning of our talk. Struck in 2019 by a lightning fast blast of electricity during extreme weather, They also embody the slow, imperceptible, ongoing, and attritional violences generated by colonial practices. The context here in the SAP lab is institutional. We're here right now in Queen's University in my SAP lab.
Sonic Arts of Place.
Thank you. And the pine pieces, visiting from Canada's first provincial park and resident here through the pandemic, have been active agents in this building, their presence eliciting surprise and emotion from people coming to listen. The pine smell, the sight of the jagged shards, but also the transformational sounding of the pine suggests an engagement with the territory of these trees and the recordings made in it by Gunn in an embodied way. In framing it as land acknowledgement, we address sound territory as a finite space, with ears actively seeking permission to hear. We have a lot of thanks to give. We've spent all the money from Shirk.
But we're about to enter into a period of 6 months of writing, which will perhaps wrap up the Gunn project, but I don't think it'll really be wrapped up. There's so much to explore and investigate and be surprised by.
Anyway, that's it from us.